The morning sun rose with a golden glow over Maplewood Drive, casting a warm light on the quiet suburban neighborhood. In the middle of the street stood the Carter family home, a modest but well-maintained house surrounded by a white picket fence. Inside, the atmosphere was alive with anticipation. Today was a special day. It was Ethan Carter's 10th birthday, and his family had planned a backyard celebration to make it unforgettable. David Carter, Ethan's father, was a tall, strong man in his mid-40s with a commanding presence. He was newly promoted to chief of police for the district, a position he had worked toward for over 2 decades. But today, he wasn't a police officer. He was simply a father, ready to celebrate his son's milestone with the people he loved most. David's wife, Elaine, was the backbone of the family. Her energy and grace lit up any room she entered, and her skill in organizing events was unmatched. As she buzzed around the kitchen, ensuring everything was perfect, the smell of freshly baked cupcakes and grilling meats filled the house. Ethan, the birthday boy, was outside helping his little sister, Emma, decorate the backyard. He was lanky for his age, with an easy smile and the energy of a boy who loved every moment of being a kid. Emma, just 2 years younger, darted around in her party dress, placing balloons on chairs and arranging colorful streamers wherever she could. Together, they transformed the yard into a festive wonderland. The Carters had gone all out for the celebration. The backyard featured tables covered in bright tablecloths, platters of snacks, and a shiny new grill David had borrowed from a neighbor for the occasion. The centerpiece was a table filled with gifts, most of which were wrapped in Ethan's favorite colors, blue and green. Guests were expected to arrive within the hour, and the excitement was palpable. Across the street, an elderly woman named Margaret Anderson sat by her window, peeking out from behind heavy curtains. Margaret had lived on Maplewood Drive for over 3 decades, but she wasn't the friendly neighbor type. She preferred her solitude, rarely engaging with the community. The sight of the Carter family's joy-filled preparations gnawed at her. The laughter of children, the sound of music being tested on the backyard speakers, and the general air of happiness irritated her more than she cared to admit. She closed the curtains and paced around her living room, her mind racing. Margaret wasn't always like this. Decades ago, she had her own family, a husband who adored her, and children whose laughter filled her home. But life had taken its toll. Her husband passed away too soon. Her children grew distant, and over the years, she retreated into herself. She rarely left her house now, finding comfort only in her routines and the quiet that surrounded her. The noise from the Carters' celebration shattered that quiet, bringing with it a flood of memories she wasn't prepared to face. Each laugh, each happy shout, felt like a reminder of everything she had lost. Determined to drown out the noise, Margaret tried closing all the windows, turning on her television at full volume, and even putting on her noise-canceling headphones. But nothing worked. The joy from across the street seemed to seep through the walls, breaking her concentration and leaving her simmering with frustration. Her thoughts darkened as the day wore on. Why did they have to be so loud? Couldn't they keep their happiness to themselves? Margaret's resentment grew with every sound. The longer she listened, the more the noise twisted inside her, turning from mere irritation into something far more personal. It wasn't just the noise, it was the happiness itself that bothered her. The Carters had a close-knit family, a loving home, and a life filled with warmth. She had none of those things anymore, and the contrast felt unbearable. She found herself glaring out the window again, her hands trembling slightly as her frustration boiled over. Unable to contain herself any longer, Margaret grabbed her phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad as she hesitated. She knew what she was about to do wasn't fair. Deep down, she understood that the Carters weren't doing anything wrong, but her bitterness overwhelmed her better judgment. Her fingers dialed 911 before she could stop herself. When the operator answered, Margaret spoke in a clipped, frustrated tone. "There's a disturbance on Maplewood Drive," she said sharply. "The neighbors are having a loud party, and it's out of control. Someone needs to deal with it." As she hung up, a wave of satisfaction washed over her. She imagined the party grinding to a halt, the guests leaving in silence, and the Carters feeling the sting of being reprimanded. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that silencing their joy would bring her the peace she craved. But almost immediately, a pang of doubt crept in. Was this really the right thing to do? She pushed the thought aside, too stubborn to reconsider her actions. Meanwhile, in the backyard, the Carters remained blissfully unaware of Margaret's brewing storm. Ethan and Emma were laughing with their cousins. The grill was sizzling with burgers and hot dogs, and Elaine was chatting with a friend who had arrived early to help. David was putting the final touches on the sound system, ensuring that the music would be upbeat, but not overpowering. It was shaping up to be a perfect day, when the sound of a police siren broke through the laughter. Everyone froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and the cheerful atmosphere was replaced by confusion. David's instincts as a police officer kicked in immediately. He stepped forward, scanning the street as a patrol car pulled up in front of the house. Two officers stepped out. Officer Ramirez, a seasoned veteran, and his younger partner, Officer Blake. Their expressions were professional but hesitant, as if they already regretted being there. David walked to the front yard to meet them, his calm demeanor hiding the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Good afternoon, officers," he said politely. "Is there a problem?" Ramirez glanced at his partner before speaking. "We received a noise complaint from one of your neighbors," he explained. "We just need to make sure everything's under control." David raised an eyebrow, but kept his tone measured. "We're having a birthday party for my son," he said. "I wasn't aware the noise was an issue." Officer Blake looked past David into the backyard, where children were gathered around a table of snacks and adults stood chatting in small groups. It was far from the chaotic scene they had expected. "Looks like a normal family gathering to me," Blake muttered under his breath. Ramirez nodded. "We'll just ask that you keep the volume down." "Sir," he said. David nodded in return. But as the officers turned to leave, he decided to speak up. "Officers," he said, his voice firm but kind, "I think it's important you know, I'm David Carter, the new chief of police for this district. This is my family, and today we're celebrating not just my son's birthday, but also my promotion." The revelation caught both officers off guard. Ramirez blinked in surprise, and Blake's face flushed with embarrassment. "Chief Carter," Ramirez stammered. "We didn't realize." David held up a hand to stop him. "You're doing your job, and I respect that," he said. "But please understand, this is a special day for us." His words carried not just authority, but also a plea for empathy. As the officers returned to their car, the weight of the situation settled over them. They exchanged quiet words before driving away, leaving the Carters to resume their celebration. Across the street, Margaret watched the scene unfold from her window, her heart sinking as she realized the impact of her actions. The joy she had tried to silence had only highlighted the Carters' resilience and strength as a family. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt the sting of regret, not just for what she had done, but for what she had lost in her own life. The sound of the police car pulling away left a momentary silence over Maplewood Drive. In the Carter family's backyard, the guests exchanged uncertain glances, murmurs replacing the laughter that had filled the air only moments before. Elaine Carter stood near the grill, her hand resting on Emma's shoulder as she reassured her daughter with a calm smile. Ethan, standing next to the snack table, looked to his father for answers. David Carter, composed as ever, adjusted his tie slightly before turning to address the group. "It's fine, everyone," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. "It was just a misunderstanding. Let's get back to celebrating." His words, though measured, carried a subtle edge. He knew exactly who had called the police, and he wasn't going to let one bitter neighbor ruin the day. Slowly, the tension began to lift as the guests returned to their conversations, though a lingering unease remained. From across the street, Margaret Anderson watched it all unfold from behind her curtains. She had expected chaos, embarrassment, maybe even anger, but what she saw instead was resilience, a family standing strong together, unshaken by her attempt to disrupt their joy. The sight left a bitter taste in her mouth. Margaret paced the length of her living room, Her thoughts tangled with a mix of satisfaction and regret. The call had given her a fleeting sense of control, but now it felt hollow. Margaret had always prided herself on maintaining a quiet life. She liked to think of herself as a guardian of the neighborhood's peace. Though the truth was less noble, her loneliness had hardened into a shell of bitterness, and she had come to resent the happiness of others. Yet, as she watched the Carters, a small voice in the back of her mind began to question her actions. Was she really protecting her peace? Or was she just lashing out at a family who had done nothing but live their lives? In the backyard, the celebration resumed, though David Carter kept a watchful eye on his guests. His years in law enforcement had taught him to recognize when people felt uneasy, and he could see that the incident had left a mark. He approached Elaine, who was now tending to the grill. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his hand brushing hers. She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "But the kids are shaken." Emma keeps looking toward the street, and Ethan hasn't smiled since the officers left. David sighed, his gaze drifting toward the front of the house. He knew this wasn't the first time they had faced adversity in the neighborhood. Though they had lived on Maplewood Drive for years, there were always subtle reminders that not everyone welcomed them. Being a black family in a predominantly white suburb came with its challenges, even in moments meant for celebration. Elaine placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. "Let's show them that this won't ruin our day," she said. Her words were a quiet reminder of the strength they had always drawn from each other. David nodded, his resolve strengthening. He turned toward the guests, clapping his hands to draw their attention. "All right, everyone, time for cake," he announced, his voice warm and inviting. The children cheered, and the mood began to lighten. Margaret watched the scene unfold, her chest tightening. She saw Ethan's hesitant smile as his mother lit the candles on the birthday cake, Emma clapping her hands in excitement. The family's ability to move forward despite the disruption gnawed at Margaret. They didn't crumble under the weight of her actions. They thrived in spite of them. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a pang of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: shame. As the evening wore on, the Carters' backyard filled with the hum of laughter and music once more. Margaret, however, couldn't escape her thoughts. She had always seen herself as separate from her neighbors, an observer rather than a participant. But now she realized that her isolation wasn't the fault of others. It was her own doing. She had built walls around herself, shutting out the possibility of connection. The Carters hadn't wronged her. They had simply reminded her of what she had lost and what she continued to deny herself. In a moment of clarity, Margaret found herself standing at her window, her hand resting on the sill. She looked at the Carter family, not as an enemy, but as people. She saw Elaine's patience, David's strength, and the children's resilience. They weren't flaunting their happiness to mock her. They were simply living their lives, building memories in the same neighborhood she called home. The sky above Maplewood Drive shifted to hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. The guests began to gather their things, offering warm goodbyes to the Carters. Margaret stood frozen, her heart heavy with the realization of what she had done. She had tried to extinguish their joy, but in doing so, she had only illuminated the depth of her own loneliness. As the last guest departed, Margaret remained by her window, watching the family she had tried to disrupt. David and Elaine stood together, their children between them, their silhouettes framed by the soft glow of the backyard lights. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. She turned away from the window, her steps slow and deliberate as she retreated into the solitude of her home. For the Carters, the day ended with a quiet moment of reflection. David sat on the back steps, watching as Elaine tucked the children into bed. His thoughts lingered on the events of the day, the noise complaint, and the quiet strength of his family. He knew that moments like these weren't just about celebration. They were about resilience. Together, they had faced challenges before, and together they would continue to thrive. And across the street, in the dimly lit confines of her home, Margaret Anderson sat alone, the echoes of the Carters' laughter fading into the night. But for the first time, those echoes didn't feel like an intrusion. they felt like a reminder. A small, fragile reminder that it wasn't too late to open her door. The next morning, Maplewood Drive returned to its usual quiet. The remnants of the Carter family's celebration, a few balloons and confetti scattered on the lawn, were the only signs of the joyful gathering. David Carter was outside early, picking up the decorations with Ethan and Emma, turning the cleanup into a family activity. Laughter still lingered between them, light and easy, as if the previous day's disruption had been forgotten. But across the street, Margaret Anderson sat at her window again, her gaze fixed on the Carters. She had spent the night wrestling with her thoughts, the shame of her actions pressing heavily on her chest. Margaret had always thought of herself as indifferent to her neighbors, but watching the Carters' resilience had stirred something she hadn't felt in years: guilt, and a faint spark of longing. For the first time, she questioned whether her isolation had been a choice or simply a habit she had fallen into. By mid-morning, Margaret found herself standing at her front door, an internal battle raging within her. In her hand was a small plate of cookies she had baked that morning, a clumsy attempt at an apology. She hesitated, her pride pulling her back, but the sound of Ethan's laughter carried across the street, pushing her forward, gathering her courage. She stepped out and walked toward the Carters' house. Elaine noticed her approach first, pausing mid-sentence as she spoke to David. "David," she said softly, nodding toward Margaret. David turned, his brow furrowing slightly before softening. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, motioning for him to step aside. "Good morning, Mrs. Anderson." David greeted her, his tone polite but reserved. Elaine offered a warm smile, though her eyes held a hint of curiosity. Margaret stopped a few feet away, clutching the plate of cookies as if it were a shield. I wanted to apologize," she began, her voice faltering. "For yesterday. I shouldn't have called the police. It was wrong of me." Her gaze dropped to the ground, the weight of her words palpable. "I thought maybe I could start over. These are for you." She extended the plate, her hand trembling slightly. Elaine stepped forward, taking the plate with a gracious smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson," she said, her voice kind. "We appreciate the gesture." David nodded, his expression softening. "It takes courage to apologize," he said. "Thank you for coming over." Ethan and Emma peeked out from behind their parents, curiosity sparkling in their eyes. "Would you like to join us for a bit?" Elaine asked, her tone gentle. "We were just cleaning up, but we'd love the company." Margaret blinked in surprise, the invitation catching her off guard. For a moment, she hesitated, but then she nodded. "I'd like that," she said quietly. The Carters welcomed her into their backyard, and though the conversation was awkward at first, it soon found a rhythm. Margaret listened as Ethan and Emma talked about the party, their enthusiasm infectious. Elaine shared stories about the family's traditions, and David, ever the gracious host, ensured Margaret felt included. Slowly, the walls Margaret had built around herself began to crack, letting in warmth she hadn't felt in years. As the morning turned to afternoon, Margaret felt a strange sense of peace. The laughter and chatter that had once grated on her nerves now felt like music, a reminder that connection was still possible. When she finally returned home, the weight of her loneliness had lifted, replaced by a fragile hope. In the days that followed, Margaret began to emerge from her solitude, engaging with her neighbors in small but meaningful ways. The Carters' kindness had planted a seed in her heart, one that she nurtured with each passing day. For the first time in years, Margaret felt like a part of her community, no longer a spectator, but a participant. For the Carter family, the experience reinforced a simple truth: kindness and resilience could bridge even the deepest divides. And for Margaret Anderson, it was the start of a new chapter, a chance to rebuild her life, one small act of courage at a time.